Any questions for our speakers?
Abby.
Yes.
It's a wonderful thing. And I just want to propose, because you're dealing with this idea of apotopia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is this use of this inscription in Christian context and in Muslim context, right? Or Muslim edifices and buildings and whatnot, and structures and textiles. And I was wondering if you cannot actually, and you were mentioning the word mirroring, if in the Christian edifice this inscription serves as a apotopia, not because of its content, but rather that it is reflecting inscription in Arabic that is copying something that is found on Muslim edifices. That is to say, it is protective because it is mirroring what exists in Islamic material culture, rather than it is protective because of its content.
So this is a really interesting question. When I started working on this, that's basically what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think differently, because I think that if that were the case, it wouldn't be so consistent across such a vast geography. That is, the particular use of this form to frame. If there is an Arabic inscription framing any architectural feature in any Castilian edifice, it is always this inscription particularly. There are other Arabic inscriptions that have other functions in spaces, like in the monastery of Las Huelgas, which has the peacocks and roundels. The peacocks are framed by this inscription, and then it's on the ceiling, and on either side of this band of image, this sort of textile-like set of roundels enclosed within a rectangle. On either side of that rectangle, there's other benedictory inscriptions. But the one that's framing the peacocks is this one. The one that's framing the arches at San Ramon is this particular inscription. And the one that's framing the images of the saints and of Mary in Tordesillas is this inscription. So there's something, I don't think it would have been so consistently used, this particular inscription, if it was generically about sort of mirroring and reflecting Islamic practice.
Because you see, like, for instance, in the mid-12th century in Toledo, the Imaginibus by Habit Ibn Qura, which is a very, very, very thorough manuscript of how to produce apotopaic imagery, is actually translated twice from Arabic into Latin. So we actually have very clear prescriptions how to produce apotopaic imagery, which maybe, this inscription found its way to one of those manuals. So within this Spanish context, there is this. Actually, I do believe that there is this ability to copy the same inscription as a consistent man.
No, absolutely, but I think that actually supports what I'm saying, which is that it's functioning in exactly the same way in an Islamic context and in a Christian context. But that doesn't mean that, I don't mean to say that Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada, for example, the archbishop who built the Cathedral of Toledo and who also consecrated the Church of San Ramon and who was buried in these robes with Arabic inscriptions, he also wrote a history of the Arabs that's polemical, right? So I don't mean to say, oh, he loved Muslims and he wanted to do things the way that Muslims did. I just think that what this shows so clearly is that there is this shared set of cultural practices that persists even in the face of ideological opposition.
Thank you. Do you think the text was made indecipherable on purpose, simply to make it not work as a text?
Right. That's a really
put away with it.
So again, I thought that when I first started seeing this in Christian context, but seeing these tirades, which are also illegible, really hard to read. It's not to say that the Fatimids had a whole idea about botany knowledge, that is esoteric knowledge. There's what's available to the everyday people, and then there's esoteric knowledge that's only available to the highest Ismaili leaders. And so there's a lot in Fatimid art and production that is exactly about illegibility, less frequently with inscriptions than with other kinds of images and sort of matrices of geometry and so on. But so it is possible that the Fatimids decided to make this illegible on purpose, and that illegibility continued in all of these other contexts.
Because you see it in Christian culture, and I show one example in the Byzantine Gospels where there's no down, they try to make illegible in order to make the words serve different kind of purpose.
Right. I
Make
mean,
it opaque.
it's very clear in these architectural contexts in particular. This is not meant to be read. This is not meant to be deciphered. It's not about standing there and saying, okay, and then it says good fortune and prosperity, and then it says good fortune and prosperity, and then it says that's not the point.
Any more questions? Yes.
I have two questions for Karen and one for Eric. The graffiti by Jews, are they found together with graffiti for non-Jews? And what I mean when I'm saying together, in terms of some kind of communication, in aphrodisiacs, for example, you do have very often a menorah next to a cross, next to a very pagan symbol. You have even these kind of symbols, one on top of the other, so you see three different religious systems fighting each other,
Right.
sometimes more aggressively, sometimes less aggressively. And I was wondering whether you can identify these kind of things in the area that you're interested in. And a thing that I am struggling, I'm working on with the graffiti in the theater of Aphrodisias, and the issue of dates. And there at least there is a building with a specific history.
Right.
If I understood you correctly, the majority of the graffiti that you showed us are out in the open. So how are you dating them, especially those who are not textual but figurative? And I mean, the style, if we can talk about style, is not really helping us do this kind of stylistic analysis that could help us or you in that case reach this kind of, let's say this is 5th century, 6th century, 4th century.
Well, the first problem is that a lot of these graffiti, and to be perfectly honest, it took my being at a graffiti conference at Oxford this fall to find out about a lot of these graffiti, because many of them, the first editions of the publications are in Arabic. They're in Saudi publications, so they're inaccessible to people like me, or I wouldn't think that's not the first place I would go to search for these sorts of things. So they're published sort of weirdly, as other people have complained of, right? So the precise locations are not necessarily recorded to the point that we want. We know that in certain instances, like the inscriptions from Sinai, we do have sort of this palimpsest of, sort of symbols fighting with each other. When we do have, let's say, a menorah, there's one slide that I showed where there's sort of an overlay. You can sort of see camels traced over where there were two menorah symbols. So in that particular place, you do seem to have that same sort of infighting. The dating of that, people think it's Byzantine because it's associated with a particular pilgrimage route that was predominantly used during the Byzantine period. When you're dealing with images exclusively, of course, it's hard to date these things. And it's also, as you know, it's very difficult to date due to paleography alone. But especially when the graffiti in other cases are in Nabatean Aramaic, there's sort of a finite period of time when Nabatean Aramaic is still used before things are sort of overtaken by Arabic itself. So we have sort of, we have probably around the 6th century, the 7th century, a period after which we don't see it so much. So it's hard to date these precisely, though some date them to some people date them to associated architecture, but most do come from, let's say, the 2nd to 6th century, most probably. Some could be earlier. We don't generally see, again, it's sort of a case-by-case basis. We wouldn't find a menorah earlier than that, and we could find certain types of Nabatean Aramaic a little bit earlier, but probably not, and there's definitely a period after which that goes out of use. So it's the script, not quite the paleography, but the script that helps us, because most of them in this particular region are in Nabatean Aramaic. But again, your first question, I think, is a really interesting one. And we see this in different regions. There's a sanctuary to Pan, actually, in the eastern desert of Egypt, where you have people, and this is from a much earlier period, so this is, let's say, the 3rd century BCE, where you have travelers inscribing in Greek, and they say, thanks to Pan for allowing me to arrive at this point, because they can finally get water in the middle of the desert, and you have all these grateful inscriptions. And just a couple of these people identify themselves as not being from Crete or Macedonia, as do other inscribers, but they identify themselves as Judaioi. So in places like that, just like most of the instances where we see in Northwest Arabia, it does seem that Jews are just inscribing in the midst of everyone else, which doesn't sound that interesting, right? But it does show that Jews are doing just what everybody else is doing. Yeah.
Could I ask the question to Eric?
Sure, yeah.
You were talking about the golden letters in the absence of reference to the light in the Roman texts. I mean, I wouldn't find that so surprising because they're very matter-of-fact texts. It was dedicated then and then, or the arches that you showed us the Constantine one. It's again about not the kind of text that you have in the absence. But and of course, I totally agree with this kind of symbolic approach to the golden letters in the apsis. But nonetheless, I was thinking about the light in these church areas and how it would reflect on the golden color of these letters, which happens, of course. That's why there is no reference, besides the fact of the content wouldn't allow it, but their nature and their placement on those Roman buildings produces light immediately.
Yeah.
So there's no need to emphasize, okay, we're producing light, while in a church, where the light is not all the time really going on top of those golden letters, perhaps they need, that tiny extra
emphasis.
When the light is not there. I find the idea of the use of light within a closed architectural space, I think it's a fascinating topic, and how they are dealing with that in antiquity, or in your case in Byzantine or medieval times.
Correct.
Sorry?
Or currently.
Oh, currently, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's very hard to reconstruct the lighting conditions of an early medieval church today. And they seem to have been brighter than we think. I mean, that idea and notion of the early Christian church or early medieval church as a very dark space doesn't quite hold true apparently. But I mean, certainly they were not as powerfully reflecting the light as an inscription on the Pantheon facade, which would be directly exposed to the sunlight. But still, there was natural light coming in through the clerestory of the church, and there were candles in front of just where the inscriptions they are placed by the altar. So I think they were still under, not every time, not all the time, but they were still under certain conditions when people gathered in the church and the lights were lit, they were able to reflect the light. But certainly the text itself could have added to that effect. There's no doubt about that. That's a good one.
There are very interesting computer programs that reconstruct the light.
Yeah.
We are doing something like that now for the Parthenon and the visibility of the plate. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah. And the same should be done for early medieval churches, actually. We are able to, because that is still a topic that we can explore much more.
I actually have a quick follow-up for Eric. I'm very curious about I've always been curious, I suppose, about the arrangement of the St. Agnes inscription, the sort of tripartite division that you don't get as much in the other texts that are more sort of continuous. I mean, I know you think Cosmas and Damian, you have the crosses that kind of act as punctuation, but what's going on there? What do you make of that?
First of all, it's a longer inscription than the others.
Sure.
So that might have been the reason for dividing it up into those three columns almost, right? But otherwise, I don't know. I can't explain exactly why they chose that particular visual format to do that. Apart from it structures the text better, this much longer text than the other text.
Sure.
And then you have that other form, as St. Cosmas and Damian, where you have a cross, or sometimes you even have a little heart. I don't know if you've seen that also in stone, finishing off the text, or even interrupting the text in the middle. But there could maybe have been some kind of, for San Agnese, there could have been some kind of pagan model behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the form from floor mosaics where it's much simpler,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
each sort of separate panel
Yeah.
is a separate donor,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Right.
But this just seems, I mean, it's a nicer mosaic as well.
Yeah, no, you're right. It stands out. It stands out compared to the others.
Yeah.
But
Arvid had a question.
Just because you've been asking, it seems to have been really important in church spaces that the light is very efficiently placed, and there's lots of candles. There's one small story by John Rufus where he tells the story of Jesus coming into a church in Jerusalem and then scolding the deacon for not placing the light properly or not lighting them, all the candles. And I have a question for you, because that imagery of light and an emphasis is recurring and it's very stable also, right? In Roman churches up until the High Middle Ages in Santa Maria Trastevere. Do you have any idea, is there a change in significance? Is there a change in meaning over these centuries?
Well, this is what I've been dealing with in this book that is coming out. You have those golden inscriptions in the mosaics from St. Cosmas and Damian in the 6th century, early 6th century, until, as you're saying, Santa Maria Trastevere. But it actually already interrupts by San Marco in the 9th century, because then we have a gap where nothing happens, or where nothing is preserved, from San Marco on up to the 11th century with San Clemente. And then we have a tradition that is much more varied, and there's no consistency any longer when we go from one mosaic to the other. Whereas for the early medieval mosaics, we have that repetition going on, we have that consistency from the 6th all the way up to the 9th century. So there's certainly something very, very special going on there, which you don't have in the early Christian mosaics. It seems like Santa Prudenciana from around 400. Neither do you have it in the later mosaics from 11th century on, except for Santa Maria Trastevere, which seems to be harking back to an early medieval example, but it remains isolated from the later Middle Ages. So we have, for the early Middle Ages, that consistency. And, that repetition is, as I said, it's a topic that I'm dealing with extensively. And I think it has to do with that these churches, they are trying to connect to one another. They are playing off one another, so to speak, creating a network because of the relics of the martyrs that they have in them. So I think really that the relics are driving this particular pattern or formula, as I call it, that we see in the early medieval mosaics. Because when we then, if you take the early mosaics, then we have no relics yet inside the walls of the city. The relics are still in the catacombs. It's only in the early Middle Ages that they start to get transferred within the walls of the city. And St. Cosmas and Damian from the 6th century is an early example of that. So in Santa Prudenciana, you don't have any relics yet. So you don't have an inscription that talks about light. And apparently that inscription, which is now gone, did not appear in golden letters either. There's no evidence, at least, that speaks for that. For the later Middle Ages, then we also have a much more diverse pattern where we're not dealing with relics of martyrs any longer uniquely. We are dealing with relics of the true cross, as in San Clemente, martyrs in Santa Maria Trastevere, so that might explain actually why it still talks about light. But then there is a church like Santa Francesca Romana where there are no relics. So I think it's really the relics, the martyr relics that were taken in from the catacombs, first imported from abroad, as in the case of St. Cosmas and Damian, but then taken in from the catacombs outside the city, that they are driving this pattern and this particular formula that we see in the inscriptions, both on the textual and also on the visual level.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was just fascinating. And my question's pretty much been answered, but I wanted to just ask Abby, has this pattern persisted?
No. She asked if this pattern has persisted. No, it has not persisted. It basically, I think the latest uses I could find are 14th century. But that makes sense because with the expulsion of the Nasrids in the 15th century and the creation of the Spanish Inquisition, the Arabic writing is no longer an acceptable thing any place in Spain. And the conversion of vast numbers of Christians and Jews Muslims and Jews to Christianity meant that everybody had to follow Christian norms as they were defined by the Inquisition. So, yeah, it disappeared.
And then travel further.
You mean in North Africa or elsewhere?
Yeah.
So I have found these tantalizing references to this inscription in North Africa by early 20th century French archaeologists, and I haven't been able to get images of them. But I think they're earlier. I think they're 12th and 13th century as well. In fact, one Moroccan archaeologist uses this inscription to prove that a building is from the 12th through the 14th century, because he says this inscription is from the 12th through the 14th century. So that makes sense. That to be consistent in North Africa as well.
Yes.
I have a question or remark actually. Since the theme is pre-modern and early modern Europe, I think that there are quite a few themes that transcend the European part, as one of you already did by going to the Middle East, but also into modern times. The question of do certain things to continue to this day. And I thought it was very interesting because with the Greek vases, for instance, if you look at the literature on pseudo-script, I found it interesting that in the Greek vases, or there's even in Etruscan master code that's the same, when you have these letters that you can perfectly recognize, but they don't make sense if you put them next to each other. If you look at pseudo-script in Arabic, it sometimes goes into the direction that you cannot understand any of the signs anymore, but it still has this appearance of being Arabic. And I found an example in the Tibetan range where they imitate Tibetan on the bottom of little statues, where you usually put a name of someone. And sometimes it's Sanskrit, and sometimes it's Tibetan, and sometimes it's pseudo-Sanskrit, or perhaps pseudo-Tibetan, something pseudo. And sometimes there's nothing. But it is always invisible. So it's always at the bottom of the little statue, and that's where people make a little mark. And only in the museum you actually find out, hey, there's some text underneath, and it's not always something that we can read. So I find it quite interesting to take these themes to different regions and to inform us more, because, for instance, the question about literacy always comes up. And I think in all three cases, literacy is not really the issue. I mean, we have, I think, vases where there is real text and pseudo text on the same thing. And we have, you explained it really well, but that literacy is not the issue, and it's the same in the Tibetan context. And I think these things can reinforce each other, even though it's completely different areas of fields of research. So I find it very interesting. So it's more a comment than a question. So.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Well, I have this question about also, it's this fascinating business of good fortune and prosperity. In the textiles that you spoke of, what's the form, or do we know, I mean, so many you showed us were fragments, so do we know the form and or the function of those textiles in their original context? Because would they have had, I mean, would they have had purposes or functions in any way related to the way they were used in your Spanish example?
It's such a good question, and it's a really challenging one. In fact, so I'm organizing a symposium that's going to happen here next month, and Jochen Sokoli, who did the work on the funerary context of Tiras, is coming, and he is the best person to ask about this. But part of the issue is that so many of these textiles were recovered from funerary contexts, and the people who were recovering them literally just cut out the interesting bits, that is, the inscriptions, and left the rest of the textile. So it's not even that we don't know how they were originally used, we just don't have the whole things, even when more of them may have survived. But we do have images, like the images of the warriors that I showed, that show people wearing clothing with inscription bands. And usually the inscription bands are across their shoulders, like this, or they're on the ends of their turbans. They have an inscription band that comes down from behind their head that would sort of fall over their shoulder. We have very few stitched clothing with tiraz bands on them, and we have a lot of flat pieces of fabric that most people think were probably worn draped or pinned in certain ways on top of other items of clothing, but it's very hard for us to know exactly how it would have been used. The images we have in paintings and in drawings and in ivories and lots of other places that have bands across the shoulders. I mean, it's not the same, it's not like having bands along the edge of your sleeve or the edge of your collar, which to me would be the parallel to the architectural contexts that are, you know, the openings, the apertures, the areas that are the edges of the garment. That would be just so perfect if that's how we
Or
were
near
doing
the
it.
edge of the body. It's
But it is at the edge of the
outside
body, right? And you do have visible inscriptions on the outside of clothing.
Julia?
Gary, can I just ask, is it the case they ever have the caliph's name in the Tiraz band, and then they function as a form of livery? Is that?
Yes. So in theory, in the early days of production of Tiraz, it had the caliph's name, and the idea was that the caliph you could only get this textile if you'd done something that the caliph was particularly happy about, and then he would grant you a robe of honor, which would be a very rich textile with his name on it. And so wearing it would be a sign that you were a very important and well-respected figure. But very quickly, in the early years of the Abbasid Caliphate, Tiraz began being mass-produced, including people drawing inscriptions with ink on textiles. And they often would still have the caliph's name on them, but they would clearly not have been produced in the royal workshop. And they would also say things like blessing, 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 blessing. And the textiles that are recovered from funerary contexts tend to be sort of in between these. That is, they are tapestry woven with silk and linen. They're not drawn on for the most part, but they do have some that are drawn on. But they're not necessarily, many of them, especially in the 11th to 12th century, are not necessarily inscribed with the name of the caliph. And it's unclear whether they were produced in workshops that was run by the caliph directly, or whether it was in a textile workshop that people could go and buy things from.
Any more questions?
Yes. One more for Karen. What would you say is the sites where you find these inscriptions and these graffiti? Do they play an important role? Like, I mean, it seems obvious in terms of Jerusalem or the Sinai.
Right.
But otherwise, are those graffiti just, I mean, are they scattered over the landscape where people camped? Or do they refer to specific sites and maybe infuse them with meaning? Or?
Right, so it's a really good question. So the situation with, let's say, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, there's a defined place where people make pilgrimages, and it's something that has intrinsic meaning. The question is, are the placements of these graffiti in places we wouldn't identify as having any intrinsic meaning? Does the clustering of the graffiti indicate that, though it's completely, you know, we would never know it today, does the clustering of the graffiti indicate that that actually was a particularly important site, or is it just sort of random? And I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, it's easier when you look at places like the synagogue in Dura Europos, where you have a synagogue, right? And it of course, is not a synagogue that was parallel to what we have in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. In fact, throughout Dura Europos, most buildings that had some sort of cultic significance had the same types of graffiti in slightly different places. And they were clustered, let's say, in the temples, in the Mithraeum, in the Temple of the Aflad, the graffiti of the same contents that you find in the synagogue, the same semantic contents, were all clustered around the altars and the cultic niches. So you don't have those places in the synagogue because there are no cult statues, and there are no places where you're at least burning incense that we know of in the synagogue. So there are slightly other places, which I think is interesting in different ways. But in those cases, that's not Arabia, that's Syria, it's very clear that the clustering is due to the extreme sanctity of the space. So when you have tons and tons of graffiti of people saying, "Remember me," over an altar, I mean, these are places we think today that would be sacrilegious to do that. It seems very clear that the placement of these graffiti is it's just as important, it's even more important than what you have there. People are saying, you know, whatever this God is, remember me, and they're sort of fighting with each other in text. So it's really hard to know in the case of, let's say, what we find in Saudi Arabia, because this is something I'm sort of struggling with. I have not been there. I think it's still worth studying in certain ways, because it indicates something that is otherwise completely unknown in terms of, you know, Jewish presence in the region and that sort of thing. But don't care about those things. They don't necessarily include a lot of information about the density of inscriptions, whether Jewish or not, in particular places. In the case of the Sinai, which is what you had asked about before, there are certain places where it's clear people are sort of fighting with each other in symbols and words, and there's a reason. We don't know what the reason is, but there might be some significance to a place like that where people are trying to appropriate it in a particular way. But I think, so your question, I can't really answer it, but I think it raises a very interesting point that when we look at these forms of writing, which seem really mundane, I mean, they're not gold mosaic, you know, and they're not painted in calligraphy, but when we pay attention to these things that look sort of ugly, if we were to see them in the naked eye comparatively, we can perhaps at least develop some hypotheses about variations in the landscape and perhaps, you know, variations in sanctity or importance in the landscape by looking at the density of those inscriptions, which you also find in sacred spaces and higher density elsewhere. You know, it's not really.
We have time for one final question. Anyone? Yes, Eric.
Do you think the material matters in which the inscription appears, or the graffiti appears? Is there a pattern there, or is there a pattern whether the graffito appears on built matter or just on matter that is not built, not touched by humans, like the rock?
Right. I mean, when you're dealing with the desert, you have this weird problem because we don't know what else could have been there, you know, what other movable objects could have been there. So all we have in these areas of the desert is the rock surface. So the question is, most of these graffiti seem to be written into the rock itself, not the surface rock. I mean, that's the option, whether it's smooth, man-made smooth rock or just sort of naturally left rock aside from the writing. So most seem to be like, you know, the graffiti nearby, which have no association at all with Jewish populations, seem to be sort of in the rough hewn rock. That people try to smooth it a little bit, and then they'll write in that. That's what you see in Egypt too. But that's what I think is again, it's just sort of these types of things that have been collected. Robert Hoyland actually has collected a lot of the graffiti associated with Jewish populations, for which I'm entirely grateful, as I said, because a lot of the first editions of these things are in Arabic and it's hard to find. But in terms of trying to sort of root out exactly where they are, even trying to find the first editions, it's a very difficult task. But again, why I think it's important is that people tend to sort of prioritize, there's sort of these sort of unstated hierarchies of sort of the way we anticipate, let's say, religious experience to look like, or prayer to look, we expect to look, you know, to temples, or we expect to look to, you know, let's say pagan temples or churches or synagogues or something like that. But in places where we have no vestiges of architecture, this is all we have. And I think that if we rethink it, it sort of helps us to imagine very different ways that people could have envisioned their relationships with each other and with the divine, perhaps. It's much less exalted, but still, I mean, if we sort of map them enough, it seems to point in that direction. So again, I think they're equally, they're mostly, to my knowledge, which is, you know, I'm still working through this, but most of them are sort of smoothed out from the natural rock. They're not around the smooth areas around tombs.
Are they in caves?
In Arabia, I do not think so. I don't think there are lots of caves. In where I'm doing a lot of work in Israel right now, there are definitely caves. There are lots of caves. Yeah.
Can I ask a small follow-up question?
Sure.
The context in which you can find the graffiti may have, but of course it's probably not in the publications even from Saudi Arabia, it may have games. There's a lot of research now on rock carved games, and they give you a lot more information because we now understand a lot more about these games. So we know who made them and when, roughly, because the games come from a particular period. And they're always, of course, on a horizontal surface, and usually in a shady area, so it's more contextualized, so to speak. But we already have certain areas, for instance, in Sudan, we have areas where the games are next to graffiti. And then that will give you a lot more information and context of your graffiti if you happen to find those. But again, you have to be very lucky if somebody actually documented it.
Right. I mean, one of the struggles is with context, because when you're most interested in context, I mean, I find this when I look at So this is looking at inscriptions, but I also deal with images too. And let's say you're interested in the relationship between images and text. When you're dealing with places that have been excavated and they've disappeared, or, you know, so the images, of course, will be in one publication, and the inscriptions that are in Aramaic will be in another, and the inscriptions that are in Greek will be in another. And there's absolutely no, they could have been within, you know, 5 square centimeters of each other, and you would have no idea unless you knew to read the footnotes, you know what I mean? So I think the game part too is really interesting, the idea, and again, that comes back to that point, sort of the interplay, because these are, and some people like Rebecca Benefield worked on this with graffiti from Pompeii, where you really have these dialogues happening, you know, between writers and people who are drawing it, and that's certainly the case, but in the context I'm trying to investigate, I don't see that apparently, but perhaps, you know.
Well, we have
it
in Petra, for instance, as well, and it's extremely badly documented, and every time I get those pictures, because they usually send it to me for identification of the games, it's always problematic, and people draw all kinds of conclusions that you cannot draw it, so it's still limited.
Yeah.
But it's kind of obvious that everywhere you can have a rock that you can carve in, and if it's horizontal, if people hang out,
Right.
reasonable chance.
They're gonna be games.
Well, please join me in thanking the three speakers from our panel. And all that remains today is for Andrew and I to make a few last thanks. First, to all of our participants for giving such wonderful papers today. To Susan Weber, the director of the Bard Graduate Center. Again, to Peter Miller and Elena Simon, and to Jeffrey Collins for introducing us this morning. To Mark LeBlanc and his academic events team. To all of the wonderful IT and support staff here at the BGC. And to our wonderful audience, thank you for sticking it out to the end. And to people watching over the live stream, thank you also for sticking it out to the end. And please join me in having a glass of wine out in the lobby. Thanks.